Born to Annoy, From Rebel to Revolutionary. Chapter 6. Phil's Revelations. Grandad was born in 1877, the son of a gas and water fittings inspector, whose father had been, like his father and grandfather before him, a shoemaker. I learned from Mr. Cowle, and subsequently from Dolly and Beatty, that like his father, he was a thoroughgoing Democrat, and therefore anti-monarchist, and a founder member of local government trade unionism. He saw education as the key to providing the working class with a measure of equality of opportunity in a class-riven society, and, encouraged by his uneducated grandfather, had pursued his own education with great vigour. Today, the desire for education is proclaimed as a middle-class virtue. Alas, another fairy tale. It was always a working-class virtue, and it was, in the main, the middle class who placed obstacles in the way of its attainment, as they are doing today in the case of further education for the offspring of working people. He'd been a supporter not only of male adult suffrage, but the right of women to vote on the same basis as men. And again, both of these working-class aspirations were opposed by the middle class and their Liberal Party. Indeed, his commitment to the feminist cause was such that he bequeathed his principal property to Beatty and Dolly, subject to the condition that if their brothers required assistance, they would provide it. This is why Dad had been able to turn to my aunts in his hour of need. Evidently, Grandad's reason for this highly unusual decision was to ensure his daughters, who he'd also encouraged to carve out careers of their own, would not be under any economic obligations that might force them to marry against their wishes, or, if they did choose to marry, would ensure they did not become financially dependent on their husbands, and would thus be free to abandon them if they didn't come up to scratch. This was the portrait of my grandad, drawn by Mr. Carr in the concert pub on Fairfield Street that evening, with a few additions subsequently gleaned from Dolly and Beatty. My manager also provided information about his own love of the great outdoors, and my granddad's attitude to his fellows. In 1932, exactly 100 years after its enclosure, or theft as Grandad evidently regarded it, the Manchester Sports Federation organised the mass trespass of Kinder Scout. Originally classified as Kingsland or Waste, Kinder was one of the largest areas of high open moorland remaining uncrossed by a metalled road in England. The Manchester Sports Federation had been set up originally by the Manchester and Salford Communist Party to campaign for sports fields in the two cities. It also organised camping holidays and rambles for working-class youngsters, not least the unemployed. It was no accident, therefore, that the leadership of the mass trespass were Communist Party members in the main. Evidently by this time, because of his position of influence within Manchester Corporation Waterworks and Beatty's contacts with S&J Watts, who owned a small section of land on Kinder, and had contact with other landowners, not least the Devonshires, Grandad could obtain passes to walk on this moorland. He was a member of a local Ramblers Society, which had a largely middle-class following. They opposed the mass trespass. However, Grandad identified with the working class from which he had sprung and to whom he remained loyal, holding to the democratic and socialist view that the condition for any individual's advancement should be the advancement of all. Thus, he supported the trespass, as did a much younger Philip Carr, along with his close friend, who happened to be Alan Bradshaw, Maggie's father. Mayhem reigned that day. The landowners set gamekeepers armed with stout sticks and police armed with truncheons to prevent the trespassers gaining access to the moor, and many was the working-class rambler who suffered a cracked head. 5 of the leaders were arrested and subsequently imprisoned. The acknowledged leader, Benny Rothman, a 21-year-old engineer thrown out of work, served 5 months in Leicester jail. However, despite these setbacks, Many hundreds of their colleagues made it onto the moor, and subsequently met up with like-minded Yorkshire colleagues who had set off from the Sheffield side. Now, in 1964, access to Kinder was secure for all, as it had been incorporated into the Peak District National Park. It was no accident that this was the first of the national parks legislated for by the 1945 Labour government, which were all brought into being to facilitate the people's freedom to roam, and provided thousands of humble city and industrial town dwellers a green lung for recreation and quiet contemplation. Nor is it any accident that Benny Rothman, the working-class communist and ex-convict, is now lauded as a hero and pioneer of freedom by the Ramblers Association. Thus, Mr. Philip Carr, my gaffer, and it increasingly seemed more of a friend rather than a class enemy, explained the type of man my grandad was, and those he mixed with, the old block from whom he insisted I was a chip. I obviously had a lot to emulate, but I had the advantage of Maggie and Auntie Dolly as key role models. I determined to try my best. 4 more events highlighted 1964. The shop floor apprentices went on strike again, and I became a marked man, although I did not know it. I also joined the Labour Party, and a general election took place that October, returning for only the second time in Britain's political history a majority Labour government to office. The 1964 National Apprentice Strike, unlike the general election which preceded it that October, came out of the blue to me. By that time Harold Wilson had become Prime Minister, and I, in all the excitement, had joined the Labour Party. My former colleagues in the AU and other shop floor unions did not deem my support for or involvement in the strike of sufficient importance to consult me about their plans. They were already on strike, therefore, when Red Maggie brought me up to date with events at the first opportunity, one lunchtime. On returning to the drawing offices, I immediately contacted all the apprentices, 12 in all, to inform them of the unfolding events. Although we now worked in the offices, all apprentice wages were negotiated by the shop floor unions, not data. Therefore, the success or otherwise of the strike directly involved us. We were holding an impromptu meeting to discuss this situation and how we should react outside the lift on the second floor when Mr. Carr approached. "What are you up to now, young Malc?" "We're discussing whether we should go out on strike in support of our shop floor mates." I noticed the way a number of my colleagues looked alarmed at this statement on my part. I think Mr. Carr noticed their reaction as well. "I think you should seek a meeting with the management first," was his advice. "How do we go about it?" "Well, if you make a formal request to me, I could perhaps go and see the chief draftsman. Tell him you want a meeting and suggest he might be wise to make arrangements for one, otherwise you might all walk out." Well, a nod's as good as a wink to a blind man, and I said we would like him to do so. He smiled and disappeared. This animated my colleagues, and our little meeting turned into a veritable parliament, with hot air and warm words enough to deal with all the world's problems and achieve the socialist millennium before the afternoon was out. Eventually Mr. Carr returned, and much to our surprise and consternation, told us the management awaited our presence, and we should make our way up to the boardroom without delay. "But we haven't even elected a committee," I protested lamely, suddenly getting cold feet. "There's only a dozen of you. Why don't you all go in?" was Phil's advice. We took it, and not without trepidation, found ourselves outside the closed doors of the boardroom. Somebody knocked, and a deep voice from inside said, "Come." We filed in, and if the others felt anything like me, their initial bravado must have been disintegrating fast. At the top of an extremely long, red leather-topped oak table sat the gaunt figure of old Paddle-Arse, as the works manager was fondly known, his given name being Rowbottom. Flanking him on either side sat the chief draftsman and the chief engineer, both with rather grim and exceedingly solemn visages. They looked like a trinity of gods, an unholy trinity, I must add. "Sit, gentlemen," Padlas instructed, taking command. I sat at the opposite tent to him, nearest to the door, as if ready to do a runner, my head nodding like a donkey. "Right, who is your spokesman?" 12 pairs of eyes regarded each other, all no doubt, like cowardly me, thinking the same thing. Anybody but me. Rowbottom had us on the run and knew it. He went for the coup de grace, having no doubt by then decided who was likely to give him least trouble. "You're Norman Cowle's son, aren't you?" The words galvanized my attention, and much to my surprise, my head stopped nodding. "Yes," I replied. "Right, you'll do. I've known Norman since he was a child. Why did you and your colleagues request this meeting?" Now I had to think, and think fast, but it wasn't to my dad my devious mind turned to for answers, but to Auntie Dolly and Maggie. How would they respond? When in doubt, ask the question, why? Thus I decided to answer his question with another, but I'm prone to ramble, and my intended question became two. Our fellow apprentices are out on strike for higher wages. If they win, we will benefit, and if they lose, we'll be the poorer. Prices are going up fast, and you don't pay us enough to live on, although we do the same work as adults. We have to live with our parents because we can't afford housing. They are in effect subsidizing our low wages, and that can't be right. You are our employers, and you should shoulder your responsibilities and pay us our due. Why do you think we should put up with the low wages you pay us, and why do you think we shouldn't go on strike in protest?" This seemed to catch the great man unprepared, and his only answer, amidst much huffing and puffing, appeared to be that we would be in breach of our indentures if we withdrew our labour. This in turn seemed to impress my colleagues, firstly with the way I had reacted, and secondly with the inadequate nature of his response. I decided to seize the opportunity and end the discussion at this point whilst the going was good. I knew we were not likely to talk the management into conceding a wage increase, nor did I believe that my colleagues would agree to strike action, and therefore I couldn't use it as a threat. Indeed, even I had the sense to realise going on strike would be no more than a romantic and futile gesture, because, unlike our shop floor counterparts, we would have no immediate impact on production. We were working on contracts that wouldn't hit the shop floor for at least another 6 months, and in a lot of cases a year or more. Nonetheless, I sensed I had Rowbottom on the back foot, and if I could end the meeting on a high note, I could perhaps persuade my colleagues to not only support the strike, but organise collections from the adults to help sustain it. The action was of course unofficial, and therefore the lads would not be receiving any strike pay from their unions. Finance would be crucial to the outcome. Accordingly, I informed Mr. Rowbottom we would think on his answer, and return to our work in the meantime, unless any of my friends had a further question. They all looked at me with great relief and shook their heads. We left the boardroom, leaving the management representatives looking rather nonplussed. It wasn't until after I realised they would still be unsure what our next move would be. We hadn't stated we had no intention of striking. More importantly, it soon became apparent my fellow apprentices were not impressed by Mr. Rowbottom's failure to answer my questions or to refute my allegations regarding our low rates of pay. I'd struck lucky, because I certainly hadn't thought out any prior strategy. In turn, my fellow apprentices had been emboldened. One way or another, we'd all learnt lessons, one being that even the highest managers could be outwitted and weren't so clever after all. The gods who ruled our working lives seemed to have feet of clay. We unanimously decided to support the shop floor apprentices, and we quickly resolved to organise collections immediately after we had been paid, and on every succeeding payday for as long as it took. The response we received from our adult colleagues was to prove amazingly generous. Nonetheless, I wasn't completely sure I'd reacted in the best way, and remained full of doubts about my role in the shaping of events. But when I talked it through with Maggie the next dinner hour, she assured me I couldn't have done better, which quite naturally pleased me no end and boosted my confidence. She also advised me to watch my back. How do you mean? You've committed the cardinal sin. You've stuck your neck out, and it could well be that old Paddlehouse may not be as impressed with you as I am. He's probably sharpening his guillotine right this minute. But Maggie, it was Rowbottom who chose me to be the leader, I protested. More fool him, but he won't see it like that. From now on, you have to be the perfect little wage slave. You can never be late for work. If you are ever ill, you'll need a doctor's note. You mustn't make any mistakes on the job. You've got to make yourself absolutely bomb-proof, because if you don't, they'll sack you as soon as look at you, and take pleasure in running you off the premises. Well, I could hardly say I hadn't been warned, and I'd been warned by a rather outstanding expert. A glum look must have crossed my face at this prospect. Maggie laughed. Come on, Malc, life's not so bad. It's just one long struggle, and then you die. So you best make the most of it. End of story. I gazed into her bright green eyes and shrugged. I'll tell you what, go and tell your dad you're coming home with me tonight. We'll have a celebratory meal, and maybe we can persuade my dad to come out to the pub with us. We can get his wheelchair into the concert. He's been dying to meet you for ages. This invitation and statement took me by surprise. Your dad? Have you been talking about me? Of course I have. You're my favourite young man, and Dad was a friend of your grandfather. Maggie, I know, she interrupted. You love me in a platonic kind of way, but that's okay, because I love you too, in a platonic kind of way. I've hated the word platonic ever since that moment. Nonetheless, Maggie turned out to be a remarkable cook, and her father turned out to be brilliant company. After our night in the concert, they persuaded me not to risk riding on, and to stay the night with them instead. I slept in Maggie's bed that night, and bragged about it to Dad the next day. Dad, quite naturally, hit the roof, and threatened to give Maggie a piece of his mind for seducing his innocent young son. I laughed at his reaction, but finally managed to calm him down once I'd admitted she hadn't been in bed with me, but had slept in her father's old bed in the front bedroom. Having lost his legs, Alan couldn't get up the stairs, and having had too much to drink, no doubt, I wouldn't have been much use to Maggie even if she had decided to fulfil my ultimate fantasy. Chance would have been a fine thing. Oh, how I loved that woman. They broke the mould when they made Red Maggie.